And good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to everybody. We're absolutely delighted to have Hannah Jepson here with us tonight and Jacob, who's going to be talking to us a little later. So a quick wave from our colleagues and guests here. And we're going to be talking about unconscious bias tonight. So thank you for joining us. Feel free to add anything into the chat room as we go, and we'll be picking that up. But I want to first introduce and thank Hannah Jepson, an experienced business psychologist who supports organisations, including education, to become more inclusive. Hannah founded LGBT Ed in 2019, works at government level as well to advise and support. Hannah, have I missed anything? Would you like to add anything to that introduction?
No, I think that covers it. Yeah, I'm a business psychologist by background, and yeah, my work is predominantly in the diversity and inclusion space. And of course, a big chunk of that is thinking about our own biases. So, you know, that's part of the work that I do with education organisations and kind of across sector as well. Thanks,
Hannah. So I'm going to start with the elephant in the room. The roller coaster of education is that we have strong opinions, and occasionally some things are in and some things are out. And at the moment, there's been a little bit of negative press around unconscious bias. Can you just say why?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, you know, from my perspective, any training that's done, you know, in a kind of performative way, and what I mean by that is in a way that is just seen to be ticking a box, or is done in a kind of tokenistic way, or a very reactionary way that is kind of a standalone piece of training with no follow-up and no check-in on as to how that training or learning is embedded, will be bad. So what I think that's happened is this kind of rhetoric around unconscious bias is that sort of training is bad for organizations, it causes issues. Actually, what I would say to that is that training that is centered or rooted in a wider change initiative. So for example, here in a wider change initiative around diversity and inclusion does work. Training around unconscious bias that is rooted to your own context, and for me that is bespoke to the kind of ways that bias might manifest for you as individuals or in your ecosystem, can work. And actually, if it's followed up in terms of how that training has kind of stuck, what the learning has meant for people in that organization. And it's actually, we're thinking about how do we then kind of shift the dial on diversity inclusion and unearth some of those biases. That's kind of how it can be more effective. But of course, a standalone, you know, kind of brief session of unconscious bias is not the solution to changing, behaviors in your organization. So it has to sit within a larger change piece for me.
Brilliant, Hannah. And I think that would be the same about any professional learning. Anything that's just a one-off, unless it's an update, is never going to yield that impact. But something so important as this, it really needs to sit and be framed within a context. Okay, yeah. So I get that bit. I now want to support my school, my trust, my district, my country, and I want it to be part. How do I persuade the powers that be to focus on this?
Yeah, and I think, you know, you only have to kind of look around at the kind of global context and the global conversation, which shows us that diversity and inclusion is at the forefront of everybody's minds, should be at the forefront of everybody's minds. A little bit later, I'll talk about kind of, you know, why that's so important and what the link is there between diversity and inclusion and things such as unconscious bias. But for me, I think trying to persuade people is really looking around your organization and going, do we have a diversity here? If not, why not? What's at play there? And of course, there'll be lots of things at play, but one of those things will be biases, how our bias impacts on our decision making. So for me, in terms of having those conversations with schools and thinking about, you know, can I support you, or do you need someone to come in and have a look at this? It's asking them to really take a kind of, hold up the mirror really to themselves and go, you know, actually, are we as diverse and inclusive as we could be? And if we're not, what's at play there? And of course, as I say, part of that will be around unconscious bias.
Brilliant, thank you. So let's get started. We've got buy-in. We know it's going to be within a context. What is it and what types of bias do we have?
Yeah, sure. So I'm just going to take you through a really brief kind of whistle-stop tour of kind of bias and how it plays out in the brain. So, and I want to start you off by just talking about this concept called heuristics. So heuristics are sort of if you like, a mental shortcut, a rule of thumb that allows us to solve problems or make decisions really quickly. So because the human brain processes, an incredibly large amount of information per second, so something like 11 million pieces of discrete information per second, we need those things. We need those shortcuts to help us navigate through what is an incredibly busy and complex world. So if we didn't have those, we wouldn't have survived. So heuristics are a good thing. They're those mental shortcuts. If you think about from the minute you got up this morning to the minute that you go to bed this evening, there will have been things that you do without even thinking about it, without giving it that conscious, effortful thought. And they are heuristics. They're the things that you've learned that are going to help you navigate through a fairly complex world. So a really, really good thing. The problem is when you're thinking about things like bias, and here I've termed it cognitive bias, but you'll see it said as implicit bias or unconscious bias, and those terms can be used interchangeably. The problem is that some of those heuristics that we talked about are often for processes, objects, and things, whereas our cognitive biases, which are the same type of thing, a mental shortcut or a rule of thumb, or an implicit or automatic association, are often for people and groups of people. So that's where those kind of stereotypes will kick in. So cognitive, implicit, or unconscious biases happen out of our control. They happen automatically without our thinking about it. They are held by us all. So I think that's something to be really conscious of here, that it doesn't matter whether you are a business psychologist like me who teaches this stuff day in, day out, or whether you are really new to the topic. We all have them. They are kind of learned stereotypes. They are things that we have, grown up with, listened to, and the things that are then deeply ingrained within the brain. They're born out of our experiences, and ultimately they are a protective mechanism. So, and what I mean by that is actually that this kind of bias has kept us alive for years. So evolutionarily speaking, actually what happens is that we have a kind of, if we perceive difference or other as a threat, what will happen in the brain is we'll get this freeze, fight, or flight response. So you will have heard of that before, that kind of reaction to freeze, fight, or flight. So that's, evolutionarily speaking, has been really helpful for us. It's been a protective thing which has kind of helped us survive, because if we saw a different species, we perceived that difference or other as a threat, we would act accordingly. The problem is that as the world and society has evolved, we still have that freeze, fight, or flight response to difference or other as a threat. And as I say, when we look at the kind of cognitive or implicit or unconscious biases, often they are for people. So different or other as a threat. And when we're thinking about groups of people. So the downside here, as it says there, is that prejudice is actually hardwired now into the human cognition. So it's a very, very natural thing for us to have that freeze, fight, or flight response to difference or other, because we perceive it as a threat. And that's what I mean about in-group, out-group bias. We'll speak about that in a moment. But effectively, that means that we're trying to surround ourselves with people who are similar to us, because that's the thing that feels safe. So I just wanted to share this kind of quote here from a researcher in 2018, which kind of talks again a little bit about what I've just said about the brain basis for bias here, which is that she says, whenever two events occur together, that neurons are connected in the brain. So you might read about, for example, a Muslim terrorist, and the next time you hear the word Muslim, the word terrorist comes into your mind, especially if that reporting is frequent and disproportionate, which we know that it is. So Cornish speaks about the fact that we have to be really vigilant and constantly challenge those biases that are being laid down in our own heads. So she says you may not have chosen the biases you have, but it doesn't mean it isn't your responsibility to do something about it. So in that example, really what we're saying is that we are exposed every single day to disproportionate, unfair, incorrect, and negative stereotyping. The problem is that whilst we might on the surface kind of ignore those stereotypes, bat them off, disagree with them, sometimes those stereotypes are kind of laid down in our own heads, because that reporting about that link between those two things is disproportionate. So it's about kind of being really vigilant and unearthing what those biases might be for us and changing it, and thinking about how can we change it. And again, we'll come on to that a little bit later. So really kind of to sum it up, what I'm saying here is that none of us are immune to this. So it doesn't matter how, educated you are. It doesn't matter how liberal, fair, open-minded, open-hearted you are. Actually, all of our life experiences, the people that we spend our time with, our family, the books we read, the newspapers we read, even to kind of thinking about nowadays, the people that we might follow on social media, all of those things, go into this kind of life inputs kind of box, if you like. And then we see the world through these kind of filtered eyes. So we see the world with this kind of distorted view. So my view of the world is completely different to yours, for example, Anne-Marie, because we've had totally different experiences. So we're never going to have that kind of really kind of objective, impartial view of the world. And that's kind of what we're thinking about when we're talking about bias. So in terms of very briefly, just kind of those theoretical models that help us to explain bias, I just want to share with you Daniel Kahneman's model. And he talks about, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he talks about two systems that are operating in tandem in the brain at any one time. So he talks about system 1, system 2. So effectively, system 1 is what I've just talked to you before about those heuristics, those implicit associations, those things that happen unconsciously, automatically, without our control. And they are generally those everyday decisions, as I said before. But because they happen so quickly, they're often prone to error. And that's where, those biases are going to kick in, because you're not going to have the effort or energy to rationalize that thought, that negative stereotype, or whatever it is. Whereas system 2 is that kind of slower, more effortful, conscious decision making, which is, clearly more reliable. So I think a useful way to frame kind of how these things are going on in the brain, and actually system 1 is the thing that takes over kind of more than 90% of the time, because effectively we're quite cognitively lazy as human beings, just simply because we've got so much information to process. So just kind of coming to a kind of close on this kind of whistle-stop tour of bias, I just wanted to share a few with you. So these are kind of types of bias. There's lots and lots of types of bias, hundreds of different categorizations of bias, but I just wanted to share a few with you here. So the first one I wanted to share was in-group, out-group bias. So in-group, out-group bias is effectively what it says, which is that we tend to prefer people who we perceive to be part of our in-group versus those who are part of the out-group. So, and that could be something that is less visible, something under the surface, or it could be some visible characteristic that identifies us with a certain group. Confirmation bias is where we're seeking to kind of filter information so that we kind of confirm back to ourselves our own worldview. So what I mean by that is, if we hold a particular stereotype about a group of people, and we might spend time with that group of people, day in, day out, and 90% of the time that stereotype isn't confirmed, and then 10% it is, we will really focus in on that 10% of the time to prove to us that stereotype exists. So we're kind of filtering in and out information to confirm back to us our own world view. Halo and horns is a really interesting bias, and that's about kind of our the first impressions that people make of us, which I think is really relevant when we're thinking about organizations and the context of education. Think about the first time you meet a colleague, the first time you meet a young person, the first time you meet a parent. If that person makes a really good first impression on us, or bad, that's the thing that goes into our long-term memory. And then subsequent behavior from them is really difficult to view impartially. We'll see that behavior positively or negatively based on good first impression, halo effect, or bad first impression, horns effect. Affinity bias is the thing that I've talked about already in the session, which is about the fact that we just like people who are like us. We tend to listen more closely to the people who have the same accent as us. We tend to value people more who've got the same shared experiences as us, and those sorts of things. So affinity bias, or sometimes called similar to me bias, it's where we create those kind of bubbles or echo chambers because that's the thing that feels for us safe. And stereotype, of course, we know, which is that kind of generalized view of a person based on their identity to a certain group. And then, you know, thinking about kind of how bias manifests and where it happens. We talked about before that kind of system one and us being fairly cognitively kind of lazy. Actually, when these conditions are occurring, so when we're tired, busy, stressed, when we've got to act quickly, and when we're all the same, that's when bias is really going to kick in. That's when bias is going to kind of take over and thrive. So actually, it's thinking about, as you move forward, how can I mitigate for that? How can I create the conditions in which I'm not always having to make a decision really, really quickly? Of course, that's not always practical, particularly in, you know, education when we're under a lot of pressure, but actually thinking about knowing that these are the conditions when bias is really going to thrive. What can you do to mitigate for that? And then just finally, you know, I think that the thing to be really clear on is that we're not just talking about those kind of everyday decisions that I've just talked about in terms of you going about your daily lives. Actually, bias influences everything. So the work that we choose to do, literally the careers that we choose to do. Things like recruitment and promotion decisions, bias plays a big, big part in recruitment. Because again, that's about thinking about selecting people to be, you know, on your team, people who are like you, probably. Training opportunities, access to training opportunities, outcomes for young people, you know, and essentially everything that we do, bias is kind of kicking in some way, shape or form. So, you know, it's not all doom and gloom, you know, there's things we can do about it. But I think just to be really clear that bias can kind of infiltrate, you know, our lives in lots and lots of different ways. So I'm going to hand back over to you, Anne-Marie, now for further questions. Hopefully that was just a helpful kind of whistle-stop tour of bias and how it manifests.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Hannah. And I think, you know, it's a whistle-stop tour, as you said. There's so much more. And if you want to know more about this, I'm going to hand over in a second to Jacob so that you can talk about how we can support you further in the field of unconscious bias, but also your school. But please don't go away, because we're going to come back and Hannah and I are going to close with a few more conversations and questions. And also if you have anything to add into the chat. So, Jacob, I'm going to hand over to you.
Hello, everyone. My name's Jacob. I am from the Osiris Educational Team, as well as the World Education Summit team as well. Now, since we have been talking with, thank you very much, by the way, Hannah and Marie, for what a lovely presentation so far. If you are a senior leader and you are watching this webinar, then you qualify for a free training needs analysis with our training specialist, Katie Cavell, where she can offer you further support on this topic of unconscious bias or in other areas of interest. Now, during this 15-minute meeting, Katie will help you analyze your school's current development goals and trajectory, as well as help you plan for your future whole school improvement. Now, what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to post Katie's calendar in the chat, and we're going to take a pause just for 30 seconds whilst you book your appointment over the next few days. So that, I posted that in the chat. Now we'll just wait for half a minute. Wonderful. Thank you very much, and we hope to speak to you soon. Have a lovely rest of the webinar.
Thanks, Jacob. And really, Hannah, thanks again for talking through some of the highlights and the types of bias. I've asked if there's any questions from the audience, but I also just want to think about how we take this into actionable steps. And how does this link, you've mentioned and you've touched on it, with the larger area of diversity and inclusion. So there's two parts to the question. So we'll start with how it links to diversity and inclusion. And then the second part is about actionable steps, things people can take away now, just one or two things to actually think about in the next week.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, you know, I think as I referred to very briefly at the start, this links to diversity and inclusion because of that, you know, fundamentally, one of the things that's kicking in there is that in-group, out-group, affinity, similar to me bias, whatever it is. You know, we like to be around people who are like us. So if you look at how that's played out in organizations throughout history, you can be really you can be really clear that is, that's really that's having a huge impact on the kind of lack of diversity, or I'll use this term, relative homogeneity in organizations. And by homogeneity, I just mean people who are all the same. Also, this term that we use a lot when we're talking about this called homophily, which is a term that came around in about the 1950s, which basically means birds of a feather flock together. So you only need to look at, governments, around the world, organizations, both private, public sector, whatever it is, you tend to see people choosing people to be part of their team, part of their group who are like them. That's because of that unconscious bias, that fear of difference or other, that perceiving difference or other as a threat. So the reason why this links so closely is that we know there's an issue around representation. We know there's an issue around inclusion. So often you'll see organizations that have this culture of low diversity, but high inclusion. So lots of organizations saying, we don't have a problem here. But when you unpick it, you see that there's not a problem because everybody's agreeing with one another and everybody's all the same. There's no one giving that kind of healthy challenge to the status quo. And we know that that's really useful for organizations, and maybe we'll come on to that in a moment. But I think for me, it really links because, we need to be better. We need to be better about serving our communities. We need to be better at understanding that there is a richness in society that our young people, that our school communities can be a part of. And we need to make sure we're representing that in a really meaningful way.
Brilliant. Thanks, Hannah. And we've got a couple of questions that I'm just going to put. Well, first of all, it's a compliment from Carmel. What a fabulous exposition, Hannah. Thank you. Followed up with a question or a statement. I actually think sometimes students are more aware of biases than teachers. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I mean, I think one of the things there is, if we're thinking about the brain basis for biases, that our brains are we talk about this kind of concept of neuroplasticity. So our brains are, we can relearn things, but especially when we're younger, we can kind of relearn things, change those, those neural pathways and those sorts of things. So I think that does play a part in the younger generation being more aware, more open to it. And of course, the other thing is that the conversation, the dialogue is much more open in the younger generations. And, if we think about Cornish's quote around the biases that have been laid down in our own heads, if you think about as time progresses, sometimes those biases become more and more ingrained the older we get and the less time we expose ourselves to difference. So I think there's lots of lots of factors that are coming into play there, but I would totally agree that often it's the case that young people are much more aware or open to these conversations.
Thanks, Hannah. And Audrey's got a comment here. How do we take our awareness of bias and use this to explore any bias which is in our practice or policies?
Yeah, really good question. And I think, there's two ways of looking at, mitigating for the impact of bias. So one of the things that the start point for any of these things is trying to unearth your own biases. And then it's about that kind of deep introspection of thinking about how does this impact on my practice, in my language, in my body language, in the decisions that I make. And then collectively, is there a kind of common bias that's at play in our organization? And how has that played out on a system level? So then can we, with that knowledge, in terms of how those individual biases have played out, can we review things like our policies and our practices and our processes to unpick the ways in which bias might have played a part in the drafting of a policy, for example? So I think it's kind of multi-layered, and I would say it's kind of thinking about what your own biases are as a kind of first point, and then moving on to thinking about and how do those individual biases play out as a collective culture, impacting on the decisions that we make.
Thanks, Hannah. And I think one of the things that you've mentioned, so understanding your own bias is key, and being challenged by it as well, and that openness to be challenged, openness to learn. And quite a few years ago, you introduced me to the implicit bias tests with Harvard, which are free, which I found extremely challenging, because you kind of think you're one person, and then you do these tests, and they're available to everybody. So I just Googled implicit bias Harvard, and you can download and do these tests for free, and it's incredible. I mean, Are there any feedback on that, Hannah? I mean, how you've seen that used really well?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what I would say with my kind of psychologist hat on is that no test is absolutely completely perfect. But this test is one of the ones that's most researched. You know, it's been the most validated, etc., etc. It's really worthwhile to do. As you said, Anne-Marie, it's completely free and you can do it as many times as you want. So I would really encourage people to go and have a look at the implicit bias test, or just Google project implicit and it will come up. But effectively, I think the way to do it, once you've done the test and you've got those results, those outputs, is to have those conversations, to create a safe space within your team or group of friends or whatever you feel comfortable with at first, to share. Do you know what? This came out in the test and I was really shocked by it. But actually, now I think about it, it probably is fair. It's probably a fair representation of some of the biases that I might have. So it's being really, really open, doing it when you're ready to get that, you know, some of that feedback, and creating those safe spaces to have what might be some kind of challenging but really healthy conversations to shift the dial.
Brilliant. And honestly, they're very simple, but it had that immediate impact because I got annoyed, I was challenged, and then I thought, actually, maybe it's right. And then you start thinking and change it. But that's one actionable step people can take away. And you know, I'm aware of time, and we've got lots of thanks here for your clarity and your approach. Just one more thing that you think people can take away to have a think about this, please.
Yeah, sure. So there's lots of ways that we can tackle this. You know, as I've said, it's a fairly tough nut to crack, so to speak. It's, you know, it's something that we have to work on day in, day out. But from an organizational level, one of the most effective ways to challenge the impact of bias is this term that that was coined by a great kind of friend and colleague of mine called Sue Sanders. She uses the term usualize. So usualizing difference. So as in usualize as opposed to normalize. And I think that if we usualize difference, if we usualize diversity in the stories we tell, in our resources, in our curriculum, in the language that we use, then we're less likely to get that freeze, fight, flight response, even if it's subtle, to difference as a threat or other as a threat. So one of the things I would really encourage people to do and think about is usualizing different experiences, usualizing diversity and the kind of nuance of lived experiences within your school environment. So thinking about all of the different facets of diversity, all of that richness of society that I talked about, how can you usualize that? How can you bake it, you know, how can you make it kind of baked into all of your policies, practices, and you know, and overall into your school culture? So usualize is kind of one of the key things that I would say.
That's fantastic. We have got a few more questions, but we are running out of time. And can I just say, this is just an overview, a flavour. We're really pleased that everybody could join for this. And we will be looking at how we can support further at Osiris in terms of unconscious bias and working alongside Hannah. So we hope you found it interesting and great and got you thinking. There are two things there, actionable steps. You've got to think, usualise, and look at the implicit bias tests and anything else that you've taken from Hannah's presentation. So I'd just like to thank everybody for their time, and particularly to Hannah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.